Okay, we're in chapter 6, and Jesus has just gotten through with his discourse, and it says that they are crossing from the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, which is interesting because Jesus was just in Jerusalem at the Sheep's Gate at the Pool of Bethesda, and he heals the man who was waiting to be healed 38 years as an invalid. And we're not really told how he all of a sudden gets to Galilee, so that's a little bit of a hiccup there. This is the fourth miraculous sign of Jesus feeding the 5,000 people, so it's a setup to that. So it says that they crossed over the far shore, and then John usually puts in there that's also called the Sea of Tiberias, which was a Roman name for it. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs that he had performed on the sick, which is a reference back to the pool of Bethesda or Bethsaida. Jesus, in verse 3, went up on the mountainside and sat down with his disciples. And the mountainside is probably the same area where the Sermon on the Mount is in Matthew's gospel, on that northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It doesn't say that exactly, that area, but it's in that general area. Verse 4, the Jewish Passover feast was near. So we are a year into Jesus' ministry because at the first Passover, Jesus cleansed the temple, right, in chapter 2, after he turned water into wine. And now it's been a year, and this is the second Passover, so it gives us a little bit of a timestamp there. Verse 5, Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, and he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? So again, this is another miraculous sign. Jesus usually engages somebody with a question, right? He's often doing that. He doesn't at the first one when he turns water into a wine, but it is his mother who engages him with the question. So in some ways it's the same setup, but here the other signs Jesus usually engages somebody. So he's testing Philip to see what Philip has to say here. So he says, where are we going to get all this food to feed him? Verse 6. Jesus only asked us to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. So John, the narrator, tells us he's testing Philip. Verse 7, Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. So also, like many of the accounts that we've read already, when Jesus engages somebody with a question, kind of a challenging question, they're not on the same page as Jesus, right? Jesus is asking a deeper question, like something about God and God's provision here. And Philip just goes to the practical, right? He said, we don't have enough money to do this. Verse 8. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. So here we have the disciples in action, and they're giving us some names, right? Unlike the last miracle where Jesus is kind of alone, maybe we're not told about any disciples, but here they're showing up. So Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, he says in verse 9, there's a boy here with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many? So Andrew, much like Philip, plays the straight man and is dealing with the practical, rational level of how things work, right? We don't have enough here. And Jesus said, have the people sit down. And there was plenty of grass in that place, and the people sat down, about 5,000 men. They usually count men, and then the women and children are connected to them. So that's how John does it too. And John is always, I think he's funny. I think this is a little bit of a sense of humor, where we're told that John was baptizing, or Jesus was baptizing, there was a lot of water, right? So they were baptizing. Here, there was a lot of grass, so they sat down. So I don't know, it's just a funny way that John emphasizes this. But it's 5,000 people. That's the number we're put to. Verse 11, Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated, and they ate as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. So there's this superabundance happening, right? When Jesus blesses the food, the bread and the fish, people eat as much as they want. It's an overflowing. This is the miraculous sign. Verse 12, when they, meaning everybody, had had enough to eat, he says to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them, verse 13, and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. So here, it's interesting that Jesus has them gather extra. And there's a few things that this might be connected to. We have the 12 baskets, which are, symbols of the 12 tribes of Israel. And that leads us right back to Exodus 16, which is the giving of manna in the wilderness. And the one thing about the manna miracle, it's really the first miracle that God does when the people come out of Egypt and cross the Red Sea. They go through, they celebrate, and then they grumble and complain because they're hungry. And then Moses and God give them this manna miracle every day. And what they're told is not to collect too much, but just to collect just enough for one day. And here there's a sense that this is a larger miracle, right? There's this overabundance, and they collect and they have all this extra that they're bringing. Excuse me. Got a sneeze there. So I think it's a little bit of a maybe one-upping the manna miracle. I don't know for sure, but it feels like that to me. But they have leftover pieces. Verse 14, the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, and they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. And so this reference, we saw this in John when the Jews come out to interview John or interrogate him. And they ask him, are you the Christ or the Messiah? Are you Elijah? Are you the prophet? And again, this goes back to Deuteronomy 18, this prophet that Moses predicts will come and will be like Moses, do the works that Moses does and speak like Moses. So here the people say it again. You'll be the prophet. Verse 15, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. So Jesus withdrawing to the mountain by himself also evokes this sense of Moses, because Moses goes up on Mount Sinai by himself, right? He brings the 10 Commandments down. He goes up there to talk to God. And also, when they set up the tent of meeting for the Israelites, Moses goes alone and speaks to God in the tent of meeting. So he draws away by himself. So Jesus on the mountain by himself really kind of evokes that Moses image there. How much time I got left? 8 minutes. All right. So when evening came, verse 16. So this is the end of the miraculous sign, this one. And the thing about the feeding of the 5,000 is it shows up in all 4 Gospels, which is really unusual. Not many miracles show up exactly the same or have the same miracle in all 4. Usually one of them is missing it. Usually John is different than the other 3, but here they all have this miracle for the feeding. And the other interesting thing here is that, and I didn't write it down, so I can't remember, but 3 of them have Jesus walking across the Sea of Galilee right after the miracle. And one of them doesn't, and I believe it's Luke, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I think it's Luke. That Luke gives the Sermon on the Plain, he feeds them. I'm sure that's it. But anyway, that's weird for John to agree with 2 of the synoptics and have one of the synoptic gospels not be like those other 3. So this is a pretty unique one. But Jesus finishes with the feeding, and then it says, verse 16, when evening came, the disciples went down to the lake. Verse 17, they got into the boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. So they head out without Jesus because he's up on the mountain alone. Verse 18, a strong wind was blowing and the waters grew rough. Verse 19, when they had rowed 3 or 3.5 miles, that's an interesting way that John puts that, 3 or 3.5 miles. It's particularly precise, right? Or, Actually, it's not precise, but he cares about the details. They saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. Verse 20, but he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." And then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. So this is another miraculous sign, Jesus walking on the water. As soon as he shows up in the boat, they get to shore. So there's a little bit of a miracle in there too. But one thing we talked about in our Bible study on Monday is that Jesus is speaking like God does in Isaiah about, "It is I, don't be afraid." And you look in Isaiah like 27, 28, 29, 30, God has all, the prophet Isaiah is speaking for God, and he's saying, "I am this, and I did this, and I do this, and I provide this, and don't be afraid, don't be afraid." And so here Jesus is speaking a lot like God does in the book of Isaiah. And here, when he says, "It is I," it's an I am statement without what comes after it, right? Like usually Jesus says, "I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world." Here, there's about 7 of those, and then there's about 7 of these where he just says, "I am." And he's evoking that experience of Moses at the burning bush when Moses says, "What's your name?" And God says the name Yahweh, "I am who I am," right? So Jesus is taking the same kind of voice that comes out of that Exodus story and that experience of God that Moses has. And so there's a lot of things that go back to that Exodus story with Moses and the Israelites, the giving of manna. Here, instead of the children of Israel, they go through the sea, while Jesus walks on the sea, right? So there's that, and then Jesus speaks like the voice of God speaks to Moses, saying, "It is I, don't be afraid." So there's a lot of back and forth between Exodus, from Exodus 3, the Yahweh story, up to Exodus 16, the manna story, all of that coming together here in John chapter 6. So there's a long one, so we'll stop there and we'll pick it up. Jesus begins another discourse after he does this miracle, which is pretty common. Jesus does a miraculous sign and then he has a discourse, and that's what happens here in chapter 6. All right, thanks.